I'm going to short bios if that's cool for you. If I could have your attention, greetings and welcome on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute. My name is Michael Chevalier. I'm the acting executive director of the Lumen Christi Institute. Also want to welcome you on behalf of all of our sponsors, especially the undergraduate studies program in religion here at the Divinity School, as well as the seminary co-op and Princeton University Press. I'm so grateful to have those who are joining us here in person, and also those who couldn't make it through the snow or even just the distance who are joining us online today. Have over 200 people who are registered for the program. So delighted to have everyone here. And the fates are really conspiring to try and keep Zena from this audience. Because Zena was actually supposed to be speaking here for us in March of 2020 as a launch for the book that we're now discussing today. So she was so great that we had her online, and so great in that form that we brought her back here in person. We just thought that this conversation is a really important one for us to be having. The Lumen Christi Institute, if you're not familiar, makes our mission is to make the Catholic intellectual tradition in its depth, breadth, and variety a living dialogue partner here at the University of Chicago. And as true to the long history of that tradition, a big part of it is helping to advance discussions within the humanities, helping support wherever we can the advancement of liberal education. So I'm delighted to have you here. I'll get out of the way, but before I do, I just want to call your attention to a few upcoming programs. If you're interested in this, you say, well, what does it have to do with my discipline? Because I'm in biology, I'm in physics, I'm in science. Or if you want to learn how to speak to people within those fields about the humanities, next Monday we're hosting a conversation with Steve Barr, who is the president of the Society of Catholic Scientists, on why should a Catholic scientist care about the humanities. So that'll be a discussion over at the Christi at 1 p.m. Later in the day on Monday, he is going to be giving a lecture offered hybrid for those in person and online on Is the Universe Made for Life? Anthropic Coincidences and Multiverse Ideas. I'd also call your attention, February 17th, we're going to be holding a major ecumenical panel on For the Life of the World towards the social ethos of the Orthodox Church, advancing our commitment to both engage with the Eastern Christian tradition and Catholic social teaching. And then finally, on February 23rd, we are going to be holding a conversation with Jen Frey, online for those who are not in the Western suburbs, on Walker Percy on the pursuit of happiness in apocalyptic times. And then also on February 24th, we're going to have Jen Frey having a discussion on Walker Percy, author and novelist, as a philosopher, engaging as a philosopher. So more details will be found on that on our website. But otherwise, it's my delight to invite you to a conversation today held between Zena Hitz and Erin Walsh. Zena is a tutor at St. John's College. She holds a BA from St. John's College, an MA from Cambridge, a PhD from Princeton, and she also passed through the University of Chicago for a period of time too, so she is well aware of what so many here have undergone. What they suffer, but also what we aim to do here at the university, where our motto is Crescat Scientia Vita Excavation, right? Where we continue to dig in to knowledge so that life may flourish. Her conversation partner today is Erin Walsh, who's the assistant professor of New Testament and Early Christian Literature at the University of Chicago Divinity School, and also the director of our program in undergraduate religious studies here. So without further ado, I hand it over to the two of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. So Zena, I thought we could start with talking about your own journey towards writing this book. because I think so much of the passages where you speak about your own life and your own journey are so powerful. So maybe that is a starting place.
Sure. I also just want to thank Michael for the introduction and everyone for inviting me here. And it's wonderful to be in Chicago at Chicago's most Chicago in the blizzard, and to be with so many friends and fellow travelers, former students, former fellow grad students, former teachers, etc. So thank you all for braving the cold, and those of you who are braving from your couch, it counts too, I guess. So I started working on this book in a certain way when well, let's put it this way. The book is a kind of an outgrowth of a early stage midlife crisis. So as I describe in the book, I grew up in a family of bookworms. We used to get into arguments. We read all the time. We argued about anything and everything. And there wasn't a sense that it was something that was preparing us for a profession, or we didn't belong to a particular class of special guardians of books or guardians of the bookworm life. It was just part of being a human being, part of, the same way that we also learned folk songs and went out into nature and etc. And I also remember I fell in love with St. John's as a 17-year-old through a summer program that they had on the campus. And it was the most natural thing in the world for me to go to a liberal arts college, even one that didn't have majors, one as radical as St. John's. I had no battles with my parents. It was not seen as something particularly bizarre or unusual. The most bizarre thing, I think, that people thought about me was that I went to college on the East Coast and left California. And it was much more strange than my studying liberal arts. So I never experienced the insecurity that I think a lot of students now experience. And I did, at least as a young person, I went to very excellent, wonderful, elite graduate programs. And I learned a ton about classical philosophy, which is my field. I learned a lot of the skills, which I think are ancient and precious and worthy of preservation. But I also became a professional in ways which I think undermined my intellectual life in its more natural and fundamental sense. So as time went on, I had a bit of a crisis in graduate school, which I then worked myself out of and stuffed it away and managed to finish and get a job, which in those days was easier. And then as time went on with my teaching, I felt that in the classrooms I was teaching in at good public universities, I was not passing on to my students the kinds of habits of mind, habits of the heart that I learned myself as a student. I kept trying as time went on to modify them to see what I could do in my own classroom. But the culture of the institutions felt too recalcitrant and too hard to manage. And I was just sort of losing track of my life. So I underwent a conversion to Catholicism in between, I guess, my first year of teaching. So right after I graduated, I got my PhD. So this crisis that I had with my teaching and with my academic life was very much tinged with the questions about faith and questions about vocation, questions about how to serve God, questions about how to love my neighbor and be an academic. I think that's the way I would put it now. How is being an academic a way of loving one's neighbor? So the crisis came to a point. I left the profession. I joined a Catholic religious community in Canada where I lived for 3 years. And there I was in many ways it was a wonderful community and perfect for me in most ways, but I really had to sacrifice this high-level intellectual activity, which I had been doing for the previous 15 years. And I could read books like an ordinary person. They had a nice library up there, but I didn't have the time to study. I didn't have colleagues to study with. I was cut off from colleagues, from a network, and so on. And there was a general lack of understanding of what that kind of work meant, at least to me, at least I felt there was. So my time there, which was 3 years, I grappled with, on the one hand, this desire, which at that point was very concrete, to think and to learn and to study, which was constantly being frustrated in some way. On the other hand, this question about how it could be, how teaching and learning and studying could be acts of love in the same way as the kind of work that you do in a monastic community is, where taking out the garbage or washing the dishes or taking care of the sick all has this kind of luminous resonance of service. And I think I made this discernment to leave the community, and at one point realizing I couldn't sacrifice this part of my life, and at the other realizing that I had received as an undergraduate this type of service from my teachers, and that if I wanted to do it, the best place to do it would be to go back. So I applied back to St. John's. They had some openings, and I since then I've been teaching at St. John's. So that was 2015, so I came to St. John's, which is an education which is person to person, which is very much fueled by an individual's natural desire to learn, where you approach a great book in sort of freedom and courage, without being controlled, bossed around, without having it managed for you. You know, you're entrusted really with a great book as an undergraduate there, and as I think in the programs that are, of course, near cousins at Chicago, you're entrusted with the responsibility of opening up this book and finding a way to connect with it. And for those of us who have done that kind of teaching or who have been in those classrooms, we know how transformative that experience is, how important that experience is. At the same time, in 2015, I was reading, I had been in the desert for 3 years. So I started reading a lot of magazines to figure out what had happened. And so I kept reading about the crisis in the humanities, and I hated everything I read. It was all seemed to be very utilitarian justifications. Philosophers are really valuable on Wall Street. Oh, philosophy is really valuable in Silicon Valley. Oh, studying the humanities makes you a better person. It helps you to fight for justice. It helps you to speak truth to power. And that all seemed wrong to me. It seemed fake, and it seemed especially to be patronizing. That is, it didn't seem to reflect why I had gotten into the humanities or why anyone I knew had gotten into the humanities. So it seemed like we were managing a message for an audience that we looked down on. And I thought that there was something off about that. So I decided to write a little essay. First I gave a talk, and I wrote a little essay about learning for its own sake, and then that turned into the reflections that are in the book. That's the story, or one version of it anyway.
I love that phrase, freedom and courage. And another word that appears in your title that I think is so important, and hearing you talk about your family and your early education, is this idea of pleasure. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how maybe this conversation and thinking about the life of the mind can enrich our understanding of things like pleasure and leisure that can reach beyond the academy.
Right, it's a subtle. Pleasure and leisure are both subtle, and I think I speak almost as often honestly about work and pain and suffering. So let me try and thread the needle for the time being. The pleasure of the intellectual life is not the same kind of pleasure. It doesn't necessarily jump straight out at you. So it's not pleasant in the same way that a warm bath is pleasant, or pleasant in the same way a good meal is pleasant. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it takes an effort to get to the places where the action really happens intellectually and emotionally in the realm of feeling and thought. But it must be said that once one does get to that place, it's pleasant. So one way of thinking about this, which is traditional, which I mentioned in the book, is Aristotle's notion of leisure. So we work for the sake of leisure. Our activities are either for their own sake, or they're for the sake of something else, or they're both. But there has to be something sought for its own sake to give our lives meaning. Otherwise, we're just going around in circles, chasing something that we never get. So that Aristotle defines as leisure. Now, but if you think about it that way, then I think you can see that there's something I call an autopilot in a human being, which doesn't necessarily get you a life of happiness and meaning, not without some effort or some discipline. So a lot of the book is about asceticism, discipline, pain, suffering, which I think is crucial to the intellectual life. But I suppose what I think ultimately, with the way we have to think about, we don't have to. I shouldn't, that sounds really bossy. I know Agnes wouldn't like that, I'm sorry. We don't have to think that. But the way I think about it is intellectual life ultimately gives us our happiness and our flourishing. And that's something that's deep in us. It's not happiness. We climbed a ladder and knocked the bell and gotten the prize. It's not happiness because our pains are relieved. It's because we're somehow being fully human, fully who we are, more than we would if we weren't doing it. And that has real consequences that you see in the classroom or in the lives of autodidacts. One of the things, the story I was talking about at lunch, sorry if you were there at lunch, the story I found recently of Zora Neale Hurston, the novelist, working a menial job before she became a writer, and finding a copy of Milton in the trash heap. And not having any idea what it was, picking it up and reading it slowly on her breaks from work, and saying, I didn't know who Milton was. I read it because I liked it. Now, the fact that you can just like a great poet, like a great author, like poetry, like novels, like philosophy, that is a sign that there's something more there. And I think it's borne out in my experience, the experience that I know in the room, that liking something in that way opens up greater realms of flourishing, joy, and pleasure, and happiness.
One of you've already mentioned this, but I'd love to think more about it in terms of the active and contemplative life. I mean, I think in the New Testament we talk about the Mary and the Martha kind of division, and thinking about how, as students or as faculty members or in whatever vocation we find ourselves, you sort of you explore that idea by leaving, going to a religious community and coming back. And what wisdom do you have to share about how do you negotiate those two or hold those two together where you are in your life?
I think every time I try to think about action and contemplation, I get confused and I put things slightly differently. So here's how I would put it, I think, now. I think the thing about action, which goes back to what we were talking about with Aristotle, with the work and the leisure. Action corresponds to work and contemplation to leisure. Action is, in our world, I think, connected with the notion of impact, results, outcomes. It's acting in the world in such a way that something happens, something's different. And it's a measurable effect, and it's a visible effect. It gets acclaim, or it gets blame, or whatever it does. And I think that it's very important for anyone who wants to think seriously or to flourish as a human being to step outside, step away from the world of action, at least on a temporary basis. So you need to withdraw, you need to retreat, and to do something which more simply reflects who one is as a human being. Thinking, pondering, reflecting, enjoying, all of the activities which somehow have their end in them, and things which the habits to do them are things that we carry around with us. You know, I memorized a ton of poetry when I was in college. This was, you know, before the internet kind of wrecked all of our attention spans, and before I was religious, you know, and so would have probably used that type of energy to pray. But I have those poems, I carry them around with me, and there have been many moments of my life when I use the words and I reflect on something from my circumstances through those words, and that's contemplation. Now, I also think that once you've recognized in your own life that particular distinction between action and contemplation, between getting results and between doing something or doing something for others and finding some space within yourself to reflect and to see who you are, then I think things get more complicated, because if you've ever visited a religious community, you know, the contemplatives are pretty busy. They're always doing stuff. They never have any time. so it's not the same as not doing anything. And it's also true that there are many people who are very active in work in the world. You know, they are involved in carpentry, or they're contracting, or they're taxi drivers, or they're business people, or whatever they are. They're all walks of life, and they really reflect about things. They take all the things that they experience in their work and they make something out of it that's real and that belongs to them and that's profound. And they find wisdom in it. And I think that's, so I don't want to be too doctrinaire about the active contemplative existence. I think it does get complicated. I do think that there is that initial very basic distinction, though, that most of us can recognize between types of things we do in a way that's external, that's directed to the world, that's directed to results, that's directed to pleasing others, and the things that matter for us and in which we find ourselves.
And one thing that I think would be great to hear about is that your religious conversion, which you mentioned in your journey within Catholicism, what do you think in terms of, when we talk about the humanities and the liberal arts, how does religious conversation and discourse in your reading religious texts, how does that, what resources do you find there for thinking about the liberal arts? Or maybe like how do you talk more about your religious journey along with this sort of deepening appreciation for the liberal arts?
I think that the way in the book, the part of the book that's most clearly reflects what you're asking about is this discovery I made before I went to the monastery about all of these images of the Virgin Mary reading a book in paintings of the Annunciation. She's always has a book. Sometimes it's a big book, sometimes she's in a study with piles of books. There's apparently a window in stained glass in Scotland somewhere where she's reading Aristotle's Physics. So that to me is something from the tradition where the realm of the mind, the realm of the liberal arts, the realm of study is the same as an interior life, a life of prayer, a life of connection with God. And it's I discovered to my delight that the tradition of her being a reader is very old. It goes back to Origen, and it's the fathers thought of it as being an explanation for her quick response, her consent to the invitation of God to give birth to Christ. That she had read the prophets, she'd studied the Torah, she knew the kind of person God was, the kinds of things that he planned, and she knew what to expect. And so this angel appears, and on the one hand she's startled, and on the other, she's expecting this to happen in some way. She recognizes it as being something that comes from God, and that gives her the courage to say yes in circumstances which were probably pretty dire, even though it's not reflected that way in the Gospels. So that's one example that I've gone back to. I think something I thought sometimes is that the intellectual life is a part of the spiritual life. So there are people who live a very rich spiritual life without living an intellectual life much, or not one that we might recognize, not one that's robust or full of books and so on. But I do think that, and this I think is also traditional, it's something you find in Augustine or in Anselm, if you are, and this is probably the way that I've approached it, if you are a self-identified professional intellectual, then you have certain challenges in your faith. And a lot of the book is me working out or communicating the ways in which I felt like I had to rethink about the life of the mind in such a way that it was a deepening of my spiritual life rather than yet another mode of escape or another mode of doing things that are not from God and do not necessarily lead to a deeper spiritual life. So that is a thread in the book. It's not as explicit as it might be because the book is written for both religious and non-religious audiences. But it is there, and that's definitely part of, it's one of the reasons why I tell the story at the beginning, because, I came into the church and then this crisis reemerged about what I was supposed to do with academic life. And I was really, this question about how do I love my neighbor, as how do I have charity in my heart and be an academic? That was a question about how to be a Christian intellectual at some level. But I also think that there are versions of it that non-religious people, non-Christian people can recognize. So I tried to bring out that also. And the school where I teach is a secular school. We have all kinds of what you'd call really pious values, where there are things you're just never supposed to do, like show off about all the stuff you read outside of class. That's just not done. Not for Christian reasons, but because it makes for bad conversation. So I think a lot of these spiritual principles that people of faith might recognize are recognizable as good and valuable in other contexts. So I try to bring that out when I can, to make it more useful, more broad, more general.
One audience, and I told you I read this book in a very dark period in the pandemic, and I think it was so important for me, struggling with teaching and trying to balance all the demands on a junior professor. And I'd love to hear you talk about how graduate students who maybe have so much pressure in terms of specialization and thinking about what their dissertation is going to be in the job market and the humanities, and academics themselves who are struggling. How do we recover this idea of the pleasure? Where can we carve this out for ourselves, and how we reflect that for our students?
I think I don't give a lot of practical advice in the book, and I don't generally, even at events like this, because I think that usually the answer to that question is something very particular to a particular person, and particular person's circumstances. And there are people who teach at an institution like this, where there really are opportunities to teach the old books, to teach person to person, to remind oneself and one's students that these books matter for life and not just for point scoring or CV building or whatever it is that you get lost in. So I think there are people who have opportunities to do that, but it's not always necessarily what everyone else wants you to do. So you have to fight for it sometimes. So I want to encourage people to do that. If you have the opportunity to teach in a core or to mentor particular students, or if you know that there's a student who's hungry for something else in your classes and is not getting it, you can offer it to them. For graduate students, I think it's a hard situation, but in a way, you can think of it as a wholesome challenge. Not wholesome economically, it's terrible economically, but wholesome spiritually and morally, which is that to really think of oneself as developing one's own mind. Not necessarily, you may be preparing for a career, we all hope so, but you I think this generation of grad students is really going to be called, if the situation at universities continues as it has with the liberal arts, they're going to be called to really try to think about other ways of keeping these practices alive. And I think that it's time. I don't think it was ever necessarily healthy to have such a strong stigma of being a graduate student and not becoming an academic. I don't think that was probably ever a good thing. I remember it very vividly from being a grad student. It was just, you could leave grad school and become a consultant and make $5 million, but it was really, terrible that you had to leave. Even if you are happy and rich. So I think that was never healthy, and it may be really time to try to put that to rest, and I think it is probably going to rest, and to really think hard, think creatively about what a educated, free mind can do in one's community, and how. And there's many, I know because I run a little nonprofit for adult education called the Catherine Project. I know that there's hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands of people who want to do this kind of learning, who don't have the opportunities to do it. So it's not just because the universities situations can be bleak, it doesn't mean that human beings don't care about learning anymore. And trying to find where in your community, or which community it is, which you can travel to, or where in your community you can find that, I think is really crucial. Because I think you don't want these practices to die out. So they can die out in universities. That's very bad. It's a catastrophe, but not as bad as them dying out completely. So I'd encourage anyone who finds themselves in a situation where they're facing uncertain employment in academia, or uncertain employment, or demeaning employment, or exploitative employment, to really think about how we can do things differently, how we can get this type of learning into different kinds of institutions, and see what happens there. And that in turn may be a healthy influence on the universities, which obviously are still the places which have all the capacities. They have so many resources to keep things alive, so they can move in more than one direction. So, but maybe you need pressure from the outside to do that.
Your nonprofit, I think it would be great to hear more about the type of work that it's doing, and maybe other ways that we can think beyond the academy and beyond the college classroom. I was struck when you talked about your family, because clearly your family was so important for modeling and giving you the disposition towards the liberal arts. But how do we go beyond? How is your nonprofit doing it? What other places do you see that happening?
I think truthfully right now there's a ton of things going on of all different kinds. So one of them, which was truthfully a long ago hidden inspiration for the Catherine Project, I know both Agnes Callard and Gabriel Lear studied with this person, Reginald Foster in Rome, who taught Latin every summer for free to anyone who would come, and formed generations of students who now have their own nonprofit at the Phi Beta Institute, where they teach living Greek and living Latin for very low cost, and they have little seminars and retreats and all kinds of things. There's that. There's the Catherine Project is great books based. Anyone's welcome. There's no cost, and we offer some mentoring, some small tutorials where you work through great books with a volunteer professor. And then also some reading groups that are like peer-led and open-ended. So it's a way that people can recover their college experience if they've lost touch with it. They can get a college experience if they've never had one. They can have a liberal arts experience if what they had was a STEM training, or maybe they just have we started in the middle of pandemic, like we started summer 2020, and there were a lot of people sitting around the house wanting something other to do than watch Netflix. So, anyway, that's what the Catholic Project is, and if you're interested, please reach out to us. We have a nice, beautiful website and things like that. But there's a Catholic version of the Albertus Magnus Institute. And there's also a school which called the Premise Institute, which they're less book-based and more conversation-based. So they focus their little courses on questions, like how should one confront illness, how should one face death, all the classic questions. What does it mean to be a good member of a community? And so they also are offering classes. So some of these things are outgrowths of in-person institutes that have moved online. Some of them are starting online, but will move in person at some point. But they're all meant to be ways of connecting with other people who have similar concerns and just forming some learning community where we can find it.
You talked about graduate students, and you work primarily with undergraduates. And even though St. John's in Chicago has a very strong core curriculum, often when it comes to majors and things like that, it's some sort of student-led, or yet other schools very much about like a marketplace. And how would you advise undergraduates to think about putting together a course of study, thinking about a major? What do you tell your own students? Where do you think that's transferable to other schools that you've taught at?
So it's my situation's even a little worse than you described, because not only do I not have graduate students, but our students don't have majors. So I never actually advise people as to what to major in. I have gotten into conversations with undergraduates about majors. I remember talking to a young woman who was trying to decide between economics and international business. And I talked to her for a while, and I realized that what she really loved was Spanish. And she was persuaded that Spanish was a totally useless major. So I tried to dissuade her from this fact, because that seemed to be the perfect example of a liberal arts major, which was extremely useful, in which there was all kinds of work. So I don't have set advice. I think that if we're talking about institutions where there aren't core programs, I think a lot of faculty have been writing recently about the prospects of starting one. There have been ones recently started. There's a significant movement for 4 core programs now in universities. If you're a student and you're not sure what to major, is there something wrong? I feel like, again, it's too specific for me to give to. So there are people who need to get out of poverty. Do I tell them, yes, major in philosophy? Maybe not. Maybe I say, take all the philosophy you can, and then get something that you think will get you a job quickly so you can relax. Or otherwise, I would say, if you have the freedom to do it, then just study what you like the most. Study what really you feel like is making you grow. Take some risks, because college, university is a totally unique experience. You don't have that kind of opportunity for the rest of your life. There are things you can encounter that you'll never encounter anywhere else. So I think it's a waste to use it as job training, unless you have to. That just has to be a discernment of the student.
Yeah,
I feel like it was a bad answer.
No. You mentioned before, pain and suffering as a part of the book.
Right.
I'm thinking through that, and I mentioned to you as an early Christianity scholar, I was very drawn to the use of the word asceticism. And I just thinking about that term, which you don't hear in popular discourse very often. And your book that you told me you were writing now, thinking about that kind of it's pleasure, but it's not afraid of real work and real struggle. It also sets you up to think about suffering, to think about those times in your life that you need more resources to face. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about asceticism and the disciplines of the intellectual life.
I think the way I'd put it just this minute is it's really about knowing oneself and knowing the kinds of things a human being is subject to. So we have a lot of motivations. They conflict with one another. We have finite amounts of attention at a given time and over our lives. Left to ourselves, we're not going to use that attention well. Left to ourselves, left to our autopilot, the motivations will take over, which will maybe comfortable or easy in the moment, but will be in the long term unsatisfying, or even cause more suffering later on. So the main point of asceticism is just that because of the way we're put together as human beings, because we're put together of all these different conflicting parts, there's no way to get anything really good without suffering. So that's a very, I think, common sense way of thinking about it. So, you know, if you become a great athlete, you know, you have to suffer. If you really want to think about something, it's going to be painful because you're going to realize things that you thought were true are not true. You're going to discover some truth that's really going to make your friends mad. All kinds of pains and sufferings are going to emerge. So that's the most basic sense of asceticism. I think there's something else which I'm less confident about, and it's not really a part of the book. I think the book I think what I just said is enough for the book to do the work it's meant to do. But I also think that if you think about the beauty of these examples that I dwell on in the book of, you know, Romanian political prisoners reciting poetry, like tapping up poetry in Morse code through the walls of the cells, or Irina Rutushinskaya like writing out poems on soap with matchsticks, or Malcolm X, just devouring his prison library. There's a sense in which these highly restricted lives, like the lives of monks or nuns, like the lives of religious, something about what's human and what's divine and what's human becomes really alive and luminous and clear. And I find that mysterious. I don't think that we should choose the worst forms of suffering, but I do think that it's part of the wisdom of the ages that a more restricted appetite of things tends to leave more space for deeper kinds of growth. Anyway, there's more to say there, but that's a sketch of what the kind of thing I'm thinking about.
As a personal question, I love how often you talk about poetry and all of the stories of these extraordinary individuals and their reading and their intellectual and interior life. And I'd love to know, what are the poems or what are the books, the novels that you turn to again and again?
I don't actually know if there are novels that I turn to again and again. I find that my appetite for novels shifts over time. So if I do keep returning to certain novels like Huckleberry Finn or Emma or something, I tend to find something different than I did when I first looked at, or The Brothers Karamazov or something like that. But poetry, I think I've spent some time with the Romantics, with Wordsworth and Keats and Blake, and also some Victorians, Hopkins and Houseman, and some moderns, Yeats, Auden, and I've been reading Elizabeth Bishop lately. So mostly like classics, so one of these days I'm going to spend a ton of time reading Shakespeare and kind of put a lot of it into my soul and my words. But I don't think, most of this public work I've been doing has not been about specific recommendations. I teach what's called the Western canon. I love the Western canon. It's what I've always worked with my entire life. But I do think that there really is a variety of paths that people can take to find the basic kinds of human principles that I'm interested in. I think we've maybe gotten a bit too hung up on the top 10 books of all time, or top 10 poems of all time, or I think there are things that are better than others, but there's so many really, really good things that being too numerical about it seems not so helpful.
Maybe this is a good time to open it up to our audience to ask questions as well. I don't know, do you need
No, so we have an extra mic here, but because we have an online audience, I'm also going to ask Erin perhaps that you repeat the question so our online audience can join. We do have a mic, but if people are also, well, let's use it just since we're all masked and muffled. So we'll start with Professor Tyler here. I'll see how far this happens.
Hi, so as I read Aristotle, he says that there's two ways to be happy. There's two ways to have a good life. One of them is a life of action, and the other is a life of contemplation. And life of action is going to be manifested in rulership of some kind, but one can, modify that. It's political activity, it's engagement in one's community. And the life of contemplation is going to be an intellectual life. Do you disagree with Aristotle? Do you think that in order to be happy, you have to somehow combine those and there aren't two distinct happy lives? Or do you read Aristotle differently?
If we could have a repeat of the question in mini form for mini mic right there in front of you.
Oh, okay. So the question was to summarize in terms of Aristotle distinguishes between the political life and the contemplative life as two ways towards the happy life. Are you combining those? Are you reading Aristotle differently? How would you kind of think about that?
Okay, I'm trying to recover. I have half of a paper on Aristotle and happiness that every 5 years I take out and I think, oh, it's true, and then I discover the same flaw every time and I put it back in the Bible. But I think I'm much less, I think that what's called the political life, I think is much less important than other people think it is. So there's a long tradition until, I don't know, 20 years ago of thinking that the political life was all Aristotle really cared about and the moral virtues were essential. I think that's been pushed back a bit thanks to Professor Lear over there partly. But I think that Aristotle is very emphatic, not only in Book 10 of the Ethics, but also in Politics 7, that just as war is for the sake of peace, so work is for the sake of leisure. And there may be, and I don't think justice, even the highest of the moral virtues, ever really ends up being a form of leisure. There may be, what I am receptive to the idea, and this is something that I think Gabriel's work reflects really well, that there are types of contemplation connected with the life of life. So you contemplate the beautiful deeds of yourself and others. There's a kind of human splendor that you appreciate, and that may well be a type of contemplation which is a bit more popular, a bit more common than reading the metaphysics all the way through and then adding to it. So I'm inclined to think that the political life understood as a life of action is not a credible account of a type of human happiness. It can be part of a happy life in the sense of, maybe you do that for a while because you have to, and then you finally get to retire in contemplation, which is when you really fully reap the fruits of everything you've ever done. But I don't think it is a happy life unless it has built into it somewhere some substantive contemplative component.
We have one question coming in from our online audience, so I'll speak into the mic here. A question from a high school theology chair who asks, what do you wish high schools did to form habits of mind, and what should they stop doing?
I don't know quite enough. Here's what they should do. No, I can't be too pragmatic. I think a lot of contemporary educational models treat the learner as something to be shaped and formed and affected and for outcomes to be derived from it. And what I think teachers need to remember at every level is that the young are meant to replace us. We are going to die. And the young cannot replace us if we don't train them to become like us, to have, as appropriate to their age and level, some agency and choice and freedom in how they undertake their studies. And to remember always that this is the point, this is the end point of an education, that you're creating an adult who will value already who will know how to learn and how to value what's good in it. So those of you who are involved in high schools can take that back and figure out what that means in your own context. But I think the great books programs, which have been around for almost 100 years, they're a very good model for this kind of thing. There's a lot of practice, there's a lot of literature out there, there's a lot of guidelines, and it's not the only way to treat your students like adults, but it is a time-tested way, and it's a way for which there are a lot of resources. So I always recommend that when I can.
All right, we have a question over here.
Hey, Zena.
Hi, Joey.
Your book is a really great celebration of extraordinary readers. People who devour lots of texts, who read omnivorously, Malcolm X in prison and the Virgin Mary. But one of the things that also struck me about it that is implicit in it, but that felt to me a little underexplored, is writing. It's also a book about extraordinary writers. And I wasn't sure if you could just say a little bit about how you imagine writing, which it seems like a little bit of a maybe less necessary, or it has a different status in the intellectual life than reading. What do you think about the status of writing in the intellectual life?
That's a great, so the question is about the status of writing in the intellectual life. Since I talk about readers, but not about writers. I think that from the educational perspective, where we just were with high school, one of the things that concerns me about a lot of contemporary educational practices is that writing is I think truthfully overemphasized. So I think you can think without knowing how to write, and I think knowing how to write is actually extremely difficult. And I say that because I don't think I ever learned it myself. I think I read a lot and then imitated and then threw back into the hopper whatever it was I was reading and added my own thoughts and so on. Now I think it's also true that my writing has some high points and low points, and the low points are probably not having much of a craft, but even so, I think that teachers in general can be more sensitive to the fact that writing will be what divides the educational haves from the have-nots. So if you can't write, you will think you're stupid, and you will think that intellectual life is not for you. And I think that's not true. So you can read and think and have conversations, even if you can't write. On the one hand, I want to say that. On the other hand, I also want to say something. So I don't think writing is for everyone in the same way that thinking is, or reading might be. I do think that I've discovered something myself from writing the book, which is very interesting to me. I talk a bit in the book about reading as a source of community or communion. So you connect with others through the book, the author, the characters, the different perspectives that the author might present. If you're around the seminar table, in your core class or what have you, you're working it out with other people, you're connecting with those people. You have to listen to them because the book is so hard. You need all the help you can get. So even if you can't stand them, you've got to listen to what they say. And if they say something true, it might hurt, but you've got to recognize it. So there's a very wholesome community formation that happens through reading and discussion and learning together. And what I didn't realize until, honestly, I started to write for the public is that, in fact, there's also community formation that happens through writing. And you toss these words out there for someone or other who you do not know, with whom those words might resonate. And so I've been kind of extremely moved by the kind of community that is out there that has connected with the book. And I think I've been starting to think, but have not yet fully articulated thoughts about what that means about the kind of thing that writing is. But I don't think it may begin in solitude or may have solitary portions, but I think ultimately it has to be something that's aiming at that kind of connection, and that is aiming for some kind of greater expansion, development, exposure of the human and all of its facets and dimensions and all the things that humanity can do. I think so. I think writing is actually, I think it's more important than I used to think, but I haven't fully worked out my ideas. Thanks for the question.
We have another question from over here, and then one online as well.
Thanks. Well, at the large universities, you said that habits of heart and mind that you wanted to engender in your students were pressed, and maybe also in you. But then at Madonna House, though you had time to read, you didn't have fellows there either, exactly, it sounded like. Now, when we can choose our neighbors, it's easy to love them, but when we're just going online, say, for 2 hours a week to discuss a book that's different from being a part of a community of learning, given that the contemplative life depends on having some of these full philosophic friendships, what can we do apart from finding some isle of blesseds to live that life, not just for an hour or 2 a week, but otherwise?
Thank you, Mr. Baldwin. The question is, we're supposed to, it's easy to love when we choose our neighbors. In large college classrooms, it's hard to connect. As I said earlier, at Madonna House, in other ways, it was hard to connect. So you need more than, a person needs more community than just going online a couple hours a week to talk about something. So how do we help build philosophical friendship? That's a very good question. And I don't think, it seems like another evasion, but I think it's also true that there's not a single answer for that question. So the large universities where I taught, I should be clear, there were students in every classroom who wanted to learn and who were on fire to learn. I've never had a dead classroom, and I don't think it's because of me. I think that's because the desire to learn is something which is broadly shared among human beings, and you can't, despite every effort of a contemporary large university, you can't suppress it entirely. Especially not if you have a class called philosophy and you can assign stuff like Plato and Aristotle. And I think that even in those large places, people find one another, they find fellow travelers. I do think that you have to know that that's what you need and want. So I think people do sometimes, I do sometimes hear from people who seem to think that they can, or it would be worthwhile just to read a big pile of difficult books by themselves. And I think that's very, very difficult. I mean, some people can do it, but it's very, very difficult. You need community. So the online communities, like we have the Catherine Project, they're not a substitute for real philosophical friendship. They may be a starting point. They may help you connect with someone who then you meet in real life. Okay, you can connect to people in your actual town through Catherine Project, Or it may help you to develop your interests in such a way that when you look back at your local community, you're able to see some place where you can connect. So I don't want to diminish or sound too like optimistic about the kinds of loneliness that people with intellectual inclination suffer, because I think it's very serious. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do the Catherine Project was just so there was something, just something for these people who really have no way of connecting on this level. But I think that you can't have those kinds of real, vibrant, in-person communities and the real friendships that come out of them without just more people who are doing this kind of thing. And that's just going to take time to, that's why we just have to keep trying to put it back into the culture and keep trying to find ways to share it with others. I mean, you know, I don't know, St. John students over the years have organized poetry readings at their workplaces during lunch. I mean, you have to be a little bit gutsy, right? You have to step out. But again, I don't want to diminish the seriousness of the problem, but I also think that there's no fixed solution. It has to be, you have to find your way one way or the other until things get better.
Great, I have two questions online that maybe I can give them to you both. You can answer the first one, which I think is a briefer question, and then the longer one, which might entertain a longer response. Unfortunately, I'm hearing the online audience can hear our questions, so we don't have to repeat them.
Okay, great.
But PhD student in classics Ben Yates asks, Professor Hitz, you mentioned in an interview that there's nothing wrong with secondary literature, but the trouble is that there's just too much of it. What advice would you give to a graduate student for wading through secondary literature to find what is worthwhile? So that's question one. Question two, John Purios asks, how do you think about the social conditions for the intellectual life? And if the intellectual life is intrinsically valuable, should we make it available to those who do not have resources for leisure?
Okay, those are both great questions. Okay, classics graduate student, Ben Yates, is that his name? Okay. I think maybe this is just me being middle-aged and wanting to impose my own sufferings on the young, but I do think it's actually really important to read all of the secondary literature. I don't think you should, I mean, I think there's an exercise, I was talking about this at lunch to the grad students here. There's a very valuable intellectual exercise of finding something useful, something good, something insightful in what you're reading or what you're listening to. And graduate school is the time, unfortunately, to do that. So I mean, there's a limit to what I'm saying. I mean, there are things which are so far gone. The method is so out of whack with anything real that maybe there's no point really in spending too much time with it. But I think the effort, putting in that effort to try to find the insight, try to find the question, try to find the useful is really crucial. I've used it a lot in my life since I was a graduate student. It's a very, very good tactic to have. It's easy to learn how to see what's wrong with things. That's the habit everyone learns. You pick up an article and you see what's wrong with it. And that could be good too, but not as good as finding something useful in it. It's harder work and it's really valuable. That said, I think the transition, you have to make a transition between being a graduate student who's learning a field and being a scholar, a writer, a thinker who is a partial shaper of the field and whose questions matter. Your questions, whether they're raised in literature or not, they matter. So at some point in your life, and it might as well be now, find a way to ask your questions and make that literature work for your questions. And the more you advance as a scholar, the more you'll be able to just throw that stuff aside if you have to. But at the beginning, I think it's good to do both those things at once. What's your question? Not what everyone else is asking. What's your question? And what does all this piles of, how can all this piles of literature help me to navigate it? That's the first question. What are the social conditions of the intellectual life, and should we be inspired to bring it to people who don't have leisure? So I talk about this quite a lot in the book. One of my concerns for the current moment is that the golden age of liberal arts, the golden age of literacy, was also a very egalitarian age. So it's like the middle of the 20th century. You have large groups of immigrants, large groups of previously impoverished people coming into something like middle class life, able to receive a education for the first time. You have mass market paperbacks coming out in the early 20th century. That's a huge thing for mass reading, mass understanding, mass literature. You know, I saw the other day one of my students had found from the 50s or 60s, like an old like mass market paperback, like Signet mass paperback of The Origin of Species. It's like, you know, you're in the airport looking for something to read on the plane, and you're like, I know The Origin of Species. So I think that one of the things that's happening now is not just that there's various bad things happening in humanities, but that egalitarianism is getting really chipped away. And someone my age, and I don't think of myself as being that old, remembers things being different. So I think that that's why I support, even though my project is not strictly political in those ways, I support all kinds of ways of making our communities more egalitarian, more reflective of the fact that every human being can benefit from learning, and every human being has a desire to learn, and our educational institutions are really not reflecting that at the moment. I do think, and one of the reasons why, again, why I founded the Catherine Project was to get learning for its own sake to different populations, to people who didn't necessarily have the leisure to go to school, to go to graduate school, to travel, to drive for a night class. There's still an inescapable obstacle, which is that there are people who just don't have the leisure to do anything of the kind. And I think that reflection on the importance of leisure and the various forms of happiness that can be brought up in it, that's one of the arguments that we are obligated as employers, as community members, as citizens of communities, to make sure that everyone has a kind of life where they can pursue basic human goods, not just making enough money to survive or making enough money to feed their kids. So I think it's a matter of moral urgency to give people the working conditions that they need to be able to live fully human lives, whether it's intellectual life or art and music or whatever it is that they care about, living in the outdoors. And it's, for me, it's not I guess sometimes I'm charged with being an elitist, but to me it's the opposite of elitism. It's a sign that something is deeply wrong, and that something that needs to be fixed if you have a community where there's large groups of people who just don't have access to these resources and can't do this kind of work. I hope that helps. I don't know. Do you want to comment on that?
No, I think that's so important. I think, you know, in a way, bringing this outside, and you were talking about, I think, the importance of economics to this, you know, economic injustice and the growing disparities between the rich and the poor, exacerbating. It's not a separate issue.
Yeah,
I think it's so present here. Yeah,
I think that's right.
We have one more question from the audience, one last question. Pete?
Thanks, Michael. Zena, I'm touched by your having been in the Madonna house. I went there parts of 2 summers 50 years ago, and the Baroness and her husband Eddie Gordy were still alive, and I talked to somebody about joining the community.
Yeah.
Didn't do it. I remember the Baroness saying, I think I got this when I was there as a college student, the challenge was to put one's mind in one's heart, putting the mind in the heart, I guess reflective of her Russian Christian spirituality. So my question is, how does that, how would you respond to that in terms of the intellectual life, avoiding intellectualism, putting one's mind in one's heart, or you could also just say, what did you take away from Madonna House that has influenced you in terms of your intellectual life?
Thank you for that question. So the Baroness, who's Catherine Doherty, the foundress of Madonna House, the community where I joined, she said, put your mind into your heart, or she also fold up the wings of the intellect. So as you can imagine, when I was there, this was something that I struggled with. And I think there's something, I have an insight that I had fairly recently that I'll share with you about it. There's a lot I could say about it. I learned a ton from being in that community. I have a very, very warm experience. Made me the kind of person that I am now. Totally irreplaceable. So anyone who has the time and the leisure to spend 3 years in a monastery, you should go do it. But I think it has to do with something else I talk about towards the end of the book about focusing intellectual life on opinions. And I think you find this also a lot among people who are interested in theology. It becomes all about opinions. And it's the clash of opinions is a kind of substitute for conversation or learning. And throwing one opinion against another does not necessarily result in learning. And, you know, I'm a Platonist. I think you need to get past opinion to something else. And the other thing this was the insight I had more recently, that the realm of opinion is the realm of division. It's anti-communion. So if I think this and you think that, then we're divided. If I think about what we both want, we're united, more likely. So if I think about, say, a St. John's seminar table, a great books discussion table, it's not a clash of opinions. It's a search in which we all unite our desire to understand, our desire to grow, our desire to listen, our desire to learn with one another. And in that sense, we are putting our heads in our heart, because you are you're setting aside your opinionator in order to reach for something more. And I think Catherine would have gone for that. I could be wrong, but I think what she was concerned about was, you know, someone gets interested in God or the things of God, and so they memorize a bunch of sentences. And that's, you know, or they learn all of the theological distinctions. And I love theology, but that's not getting close to God. She's right about that. Like, God, you have to open your whole heart to God. It's not a matter of just learning some stuff or wearing a different outfit. You know, you have to go all the way in. So I think the same is true for learning. And I think she knew that, and I think she was exposed to the type of intellectual climate that I'm trying to recover from the early 20th century. And I think that really made her who she was. So I don't know, maybe she would tell me that I'm still being too intellectual and I need to go live in the hermitage and longer. But I think that she wouldn't. I think she would understand what I meant. And I think that we think too much about these narrow uses of our mind, which are divisive and which are superficial. And we don't think enough about the ways in which the life of the mind is really guided by desire and love and things that we don't fully understand and can't fully articulate. And you know, that's one of the things I really try to communicate in the book, however well I did it or not. I hope that helps. Thank you for your question. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Well, with that, before we close this night, Lumen Christi has a strong commitment to engaging the life of the mind, and especially setting it in conversation with the Catholic intellectual tradition. I'd invite any students here to participate in some of our upcoming reading groups that we have. We have a non-credit course led by our scholar resident, Father Pete Bernardi, on Testimonies to Grace. We have a Koine reading group that we've started. We've got an Aquinas reading group, and we even have a Nietzsche reading group that is coming up. So certainly invite you to participate in that. For those joining us online or interested in our public programs, go to our website for more details on programs with Jen Frey, a new Faith and Reason series that we're going to be launching within the city, and then much, much more, including the multiverse, Eastern Orthodox social ethics documents, and so on. But I'd also invite you to continue the conversation, certainly here within the room for those who are sticking around a bit, For those online or here, you can take Zena home with you. That is to say, the book is available for sale by the seminary co-op outside. It's also one of our favorite independent bookstores to support and partner with. If you fill out the survey online, and we'll send it to all the people who participate here by email tomorrow, you can enter a raffle for a gift card to purchase a book. But you could also today just use your hard-earned money to purchase Zena's book and continue the conversation at home. But I'd be remiss if I didn't invite you to join me in thanking both Professor Erin Walsh and Professor Zena Hitz for leading us in a wonderful conversation today.